You have been told to stop eating bread. You have been told to avoid rice, to leave potatoes off your plate, to treat the foods that have anchored your meals for your entire life as though they are now the enemy of your health. And if you are a woman over 60 managing blood sugar, that advice lands differently than it does for anyone else. Because those foods are not just carbohydrates on a chart. They are Sunday dinners. They are the bread your mother made. They are the rice that has been on your table at every family meal you can remember. Being told to eliminate them does not feel like a medical recommendation. It feels like being told to give up something that connects you to the people and moments that matter most. I want to tell you something different today, and I want to back it with the science that makes it true rather than just the reassurance that makes it comfortable. You do not have to give up these foods. What you need to understand is how to prepare them, combine them, sequence them, and time them in ways that fundamentally change how your body processes them. The same food, handled differently, produces a completely different blood sugar response. And once you understand the mechanisms behind that, you have tools you can use every single day without dismantling the meals that give your life structure and pleasure. My name is Dr. Reina Sato. I am a preventive medicine physician and longevity researcher. And the management of blood sugar through dietary strategy in women over 60 is an area where the gap between what the current evidence supports and what patients are actually told remains wider than it should be. The most restrictive advice is not always the most effective advice. The patients I have seen manage their blood sugar most successfully over the long term are not the ones following the most punishing protocols. They are the ones who understand the underlying biology well enough to make intelligent, sustainable choices within a real life. That is what today is about. Before we go further, one essential clinical note. Everything I am sharing today is based on peer-reviewed research and represents general educational information. I am not your physician. Please discuss any changes to your diet or medical regimen with your own doctor before implementing them, particularly if you are on insulin or blood sugar-lowering medications. The strategies I am about to describe can meaningfully lower post-meal glucose, and your medication doses may need adjustment in response to those improvements. Now, what is actually happening in your body when you eat a starchy food, and why the preparation of that food matters more than most people are told. When you eat white bread, freshly cooked white rice, or a baked potato straight from the oven, the starch in those foods is broken down rapidly by digestive enzymes in your small intestine. Individual glucose molecules flood into the bloodstream quickly. Blood sugar rises sharply. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin to clear that glucose. If your insulin response is sluggish, or if your cells have become resistant to insulin's signal, which is increasingly common in women after 60 due to the hormonal shifts of the menopausal transition and the natural decline in lean muscle mass that drives glucose disposal, that spike stays elevated longer than it should. Repeated cycles of sharp post-meal glucose spikes are exactly what accelerates insulin resistance, places cumulative stress on the pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin, and drives the progressive worsening of blood sugar control over time. But there is a specific property of starchy foods that most people managing blood sugar have never been told about, and understanding it changes what you do in your kitchen before you ever sit down to eat. It is called resistant starch. Resistant starch behaves completely differently from regular digestible starch. As the name indicates, it resists the digestive enzymes in your small intestine. Rather than being broken down into glucose and absorbed there, resistant starch travels largely intact to your large intestine. Your gut bacteria ferment it. The products of that fermentation are short-chain fatty acids, including a compound called butyrate. Butyrate does several things that are directly relevant to blood sugar control in ways that go beyond simply raising your blood sugar less. It improves insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues, meaning your muscle cells and liver cells become more responsive to insulin's signal to take up glucose. It reduces systemic inflammation, which is one of the primary drivers of insulin resistance, and it supports the integrity of the intestinal lining, reducing the intestinal permeability that contributes to metabolic dysfunction. Resistant starch is not simply a carbohydrate that raises blood sugar less. It is actively improving the underlying metabolic environment that makes blood sugar control difficult in the first place. Now here is the part that changes what you do tonight. You can significantly increase the resistant starch content of the foods you are already eating without changing what you eat. you change how you prepare it. When you cook a starchy food, rice, potatoes, or pasta, and then cool it down, part of the starch undergoes a process called retrogradation. The starch molecules, which were loosened and made accessible by the heat of cooking, realign into tight crystalline structures as they cool. These structures are what your digestive enzymes cannot efficiently break down. The starch has been physically transformed into something that behaves more like fiber than like rapidly digestible carbohydrate. Multiple studies have confirmed this effect. Cooling cooked rice or potatoes to refrigerator temperature for 24 hours significantly increases their resistant starch content compared to freshly cooked versions. And when you reheat the cooled food, a meaningful portion of that resistant starch is preserved. The retrogradation is not fully reversed by gentle reheating. You get food that tastes nearly identical to what you are accustomed to eating with a substantially different metabolic impact. The clinical evidence is specific. Studies show that eating cooled and reheated rice or potatoes compared to freshly cooked versions produces measurably lower post-meal blood sugar spikes and lower insulin responses. Same food, same portion, prepared one way versus another. The blood sugar curve looks meaningfully different. If you eat rice regularly, cook a larger batch, refrigerate it overnight, and reheat it for your next meal. The same principle applies to potatoes. Even bread that has been frozen and then toasted has a higher resistant starch content than fresh bread from the same loaf. These are not dramatic changes to your cooking routine. They are small preparation habits with real metabolic consequences. Beyond the cooking and cooling strategy, foods that are naturally rich in resistant starch belong in your regular rotation. Legumes are the most concentrated natural source available. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas all contain high amounts of resistant starch alongside soluble fiber that further slows glucose absorption. Steel-cut oats, rather than instant or quick oats, contain meaningful resistant starch because their physical structure has not been disrupted by processing. Slightly underripe bananas contain significantly more resistant starch than fully ripe ones, because the ripening process progressively converts resistant starch to readily digestible sugar. The second strategy is food pairing, and this is one of the highest impact changes you can make without altering what you eat, only what you eat alongside it. Carbohydrates eaten in isolation produce the sharpest blood sugar responses. When you eat a starchy food alongside protein, fat, fiber, or an acidic component, you fundamentally change how quickly that starch is broken down and how quickly the resulting glucose enters your bloodstream. A meta-analysis of 154 controlled trials found that adding protein to a carbohydrate-containing meal reduced the glucose area under the curve by up to 50%. That is not a modest effect. The blood sugar impact of a meal reduced by half simply by including a protein source alongside the carbohydrate. The mechanism involves stimulation of GLP-1, the same hormone targeted by some of the newer diabetes medications, which slows gastric emptying and smooths the delivery of glucose into the bloodstream. Dietary fat produces a similar moderating effect. Fat slows the rate at which food leaves the stomach, extending the time over which glucose is absorbed and reducing the sharpness of the peak. This is the biological reason why rice and beans is metabolically superior to rice alone, why potatoes prepared with olive oil produce a gentler glucose curve than plain potatoes. The fat and protein are changing the kinetics of glucose absorption in ways that matter clinically. Adding an acidic component to meals is a practical tool with solid evidence behind it. Vinegar, lemon juice, or lime juice consumed with or immediately before a starchy meal reduces the rate at which starch is broken down by digestive enzymes. Acetic acid in vinegar also improves insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue and can blunt glucose production by the liver. A small amount of apple cider vinegar in water before a meal or lemon juice as part of a salad dressing served before the starchy component of the meal produces a measurable difference in post-meal glucose response. Fermented foods including kimchi, sauerkraut, and miso contain organic acids from fermentation that exert a similar effect while additionally supporting the gut microbiome that plays a long-term role in metabolic health. The third strategy is food sequencing, and this is one of the most powerful tools available for managing post-meal blood sugar because it requires no change to what you eat and no change to how much you eat, only the order in which you eat it. When you begin a meal with bread, rice, or any rapidly digestible carbohydrate, that starch hits your digestive system immediately, with nothing to slow its breakdown. The glucose spike begins within minutes and peaks sharply. When you eat protein and vegetables first and reserve the starchy carbohydrate for the end of the meal, the protein and fiber you have already consumed slow the rate at which your stomach empties its contents into the small intestine. The glucose from the starch you eat at the end is released into a digestive environment where gastric emptying is already slowed. It enters the bloodstream gradually rather than in a surge. A randomized controlled crossover trial produced specific numbers. Participants with type 2 diabetes who ate their protein and vegetables before their carbohydrates had a 40% lower glucose area under the curve compared to when they ate the same foods in the reverse order. Their insulin response was 31% lower. Same meal, identical food, identical portions. Different sequence, dramatically different metabolic outcome. The practical application is immediate. When you sit down to a meal, begin with your salad, your vegetables, or your protein. Eat those completely or substantially before moving to your rice, bread, or potatoes. At a restaurant, let the bread basket sit and begin with your water and any vegetables while you wait. This single behavioral shift, requiring no change to what you order or what you cook, can meaningfully flatten your post-meal glucose curve at every meal for the rest of your life. The fourth strategy is post-meal movement, and the research on this is consistently impressive for how large an effect such a small behavioral change produces. A randomized controlled trial found that a 10-minute walk taken immediately after a meal produces a meaningful reduction in post-meal blood glucose compared to sitting. 10 minutes, not a structured workout, not a gym session. A 10-minute walk around the block, around the living room, or through the house. The mechanism is specific. When you walk, you activate the soleus muscle, which sits deep in the calf below the more visible gastrocnemius. The soleus is composed predominantly of slow-twitch muscle fibers that can sustain contraction for extended periods without fatiguing. And because skeletal muscle contraction during movement takes up glucose from the bloodstream through an insulin-independent pathway, the soleus functions as a glucose disposal mechanism that operates regardless of your level of insulin resistance. It does not wait for insulin to unlock the cellular door. It opens a separate entrance entirely. The timing matters significantly. The earlier you move after eating, the more effectively you intercept the glucose rise before it peaks. The ideal window is within 15 to 30 minutes of finishing your meal. I want to tell you about a patient I will call Eleanor. 71 years old. She had been managing prediabetes for 3 years with reasonable dietary compliance but persistent post-meal glucose readings that frustrated her because she felt she was doing everything she had been told. Her afternoon numbers in particular were consistently higher than her morning readings despite eating what she described as her lightest meal at lunch. When I reviewed her daily pattern, 3 things stood out. She was eating her lunch carbohydrates first, as a habit from decades of eating bread with soup at the start of the meal. She was sitting at her kitchen table for the remainder of the afternoon after lunch with no movement in the post-meal window. And her protein intake at lunch was minimal. We made 3 changes only. She began eating her soup with vegetables and any protein first and saved the bread for the end of the meal. She began taking a 10-minute walk after lunch, which she described as easy to fit into her day because she had been meaning to get more fresh air anyway. And she added an egg or a portion of cottage cheese to her lunch to increase the protein pairing. At her next appointment 6 weeks later, her post-lunch glucose readings had dropped by an average of 31 points. Her fasting glucose the following mornings had also improved because her afternoon glucose was no longer remaining elevated into the evening hours. Nothing she was eating had changed. How she was eating it had changed completely. The fifth strategy addresses the quality of the carbohydrates you choose. And I want to be clear that this is distinct from recommending a low-carbohydrate diet. The problem is not carbohydrates as a category. The problem is what modern food processing has done to the physical structure of carbohydrates in ways that make them absorb at rates your blood sugar management system was not designed to handle. When wheat is milled into fine white flour, the grain is ground into particles so small that digestive enzymes can access virtually the entire surface area simultaneously. The starch breaks down almost instantly. White bread, crackers, commercial pasta, instant oatmeal, and most breakfast cereals share this characteristic. They are made from finely processed starches that digest and absorb at rates that overwhelm glucose management capacity that is already under strain. Compare that to steel-cut oats, intact whole grains like barley or farro, or legumes. These foods have not had their physical structure disrupted by milling. Digestive enzymes must work through intact cell walls and fibrous matrices to access the starch inside. The process is slow. Glucose enters the bloodstream gradually. The blood sugar curve is flatter, the insulin response is smaller, and the satiety is more sustained. When you are choosing carbohydrates, look for foods where you can see the whole grain structure, steel-cut oats rather than instant. Dense, chewy whole grain bread with visible texture rather than soft commercial bread that is essentially fine flour with added coloring. Legumes at every practical opportunity. These choices do not require eliminating carbohydrates. They require shifting toward carbohydrates whose physical structure works with your metabolic system rather than overwhelming it. Fiber deserves specific emphasis here. Soluble fiber, found in oats, legumes, and many vegetables, forms a gel-like matrix in the intestine that physically slows the diffusion of glucose to the intestinal wall. If you are reducing your carbohydrate intake for blood sugar management, fiber should be the last thing you reduce. It is the most metabolically valuable component of your carbohydrate-containing foods and the one whose absence most undermines your long-term metabolic health. The sixth strategy is meal timing, and specifically the timing of your last meal relative to sleep. For women over 60, this strategy carries additional significance beyond what applies to the general population. Your body's ability to process glucose follows a clear circadian rhythm. Insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and declines progressively through the day. By the evening hours, your pancreatic beta cells are less responsive and your tissues are less insulin sensitive. The same meal that would produce a moderate glucose response at noon produces a significantly larger response at 9 in the evening. There is a specific hormonal mechanism that compounds this problem. In the hours before sleep, your body produces elevated melatonin, the hormone that signals the onset of the sleep phase. Melatonin receptors are present on pancreatic beta cells, and melatonin directly suppresses insulin secretion through those receptors. So, in the late evening window, when insulin sensitivity is already at its lowest point in the circadian cycle, rising melatonin is simultaneously reducing your pancreas's ability to produce the insulin that would clear a post-meal glucose rise. Eating a carbohydrate-containing meal close to bedtime is therefore metabolically the worst possible timing. Less insulin available. Tissues less responsive to what insulin is produced. Glucose stays elevated far longer than it would from the same meal eaten earlier. Eating your last meal of the day, at least 3 hours before your typical bedtime, significantly reduces this effect. The earlier your dinner, the better your overnight glucose profile, and the lower your fasting blood sugar the following morning will tend to be. If you currently eat late due to family schedule or habit, shifting dinner earlier is one of the highest single-impact timing changes available to you. Let me bring all of this together into the practical framework you can begin applying today. Cook your rice, potatoes, or pasta. Cool them in the refrigerator overnight and reheat gently before eating. This one preparation change meaningfully increases resistant starch content and reduces the post-meal glucose response from foods you were already planning to eat. At every meal containing starch, include a protein source, a healthy fat, and where possible an acidic component such as a small salad dressed with vinegar or a squeeze of lemon. These 3 additions change the kinetics of glucose absorption from the starchy component of the meal in ways that matter clinically. Begin every meal with your protein and vegetables. Save your rice, bread, or potato for the end. A 40% reduction in post-meal glucose from a behavioral change that requires no alteration to what you eat is one of the most favorable effort-to-outcome ratios in all of nutritional medicine. Take a 10-minute walk within 30 minutes of finishing your main meal. If walking is not available, light household activity in that window engages the same insulin-independent glucose clearance mechanism, though walking has the strongest evidence. Choose carbohydrates with visible whole grain structure over finely processed alternatives whenever the choice is available to you. Eat your last meal of the day at least 3 hours before your bedtime to align your food intake with the circadian rhythm of your body's insulin sensitivity. None of these strategies requires you to give up the foods that anchor your daily meals and connect you to the people and traditions that matter to you. They require understanding the biology well enough to work with your body rather than against it. Your body is capable of significantly better blood sugar control than your current numbers may suggest. It has not failed. It has been given incomplete information about how to feed it intelligently. Give it the right inputs applied consistently, and the response often begins faster than most people expect. I am Dr. Reina Sato. If this gave you practical tools that your clinical appointments have not had time to provide, share this with someone who has been told only what she cannot eat without being told how to eat what she loves more intelligently. The goal was never deprivation. The goal was always understanding. I will see you in the next one.